Hey guys, this is Brian from RPG Site, and today I'm looking at Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. Now I reviewed Deadfire for RPGsite.net last week, so you can head over to the website if you want to see the main review and my thoughts on it, but I did want to pair with it a sort of video review to kind of touch on some of the parts of the game that didn't get to make it into my thoughts in that article. I actually had the chance to talk to Obsidian Entertainment at E3 2017 about Deadfire, and there was clearly a lot of excitement for the game. It had just passed $4 million on Fig. It had exceeded what the original game was able to do on Kickstarter, so clearly a lot of people were looking forward to this. But at the same time, there was this general sense of wondering if the game would feel iterative. It would have been Obsidian's third isometric CRPG in the last handful of years, after Tyranny and of course the original Pillars, so it wasn't 100% sure how Deadfire could really push the envelope further. After getting a chance to sit down and talk to these guys, it was clear that Deadfire was something different, and mainly in the sense that it was Obsidian finally able to iterate on one of their own properties. They weren't working on someone else's franchise and creating their own spin, which they've been successful at also, but this is the first time they've been able to really learn and refine from their own works, not only iterating on Pillars of Eternity, but also borrowing ideas that they learned from Tyranny, which I'll get to later in the video. The first thing that's immediately obvious about Deadfire is the extent that it leans into this whole motif of pirate ships, island exploration, and all of those related themes. Now, the original Pillars of Eternity, in my opinion, didn't really have such a quite on-the-nose theme or motif going for it. It had this general idea about the manifestation of souls and being able to see them and interact with them and converse with the dead, and bodies being born with improper or unfinished souls. Sort of these things that are a bit more nebulous, a bit less easy to pin down or give an elevator speech on what the title was about. In Deadfire, you play as the same player character from the first game, but the location, the Deadfire Archipelago, is quite a ways removed from the location of the first game, and the story is only really loosely tied to it. So it is a direct sequel, but also in the sense where you could jump in on Deadfire and there's enough background given to the player that you're not ever felt lost, but players that do have the history will catch the references and the follow-ups. So it's a good balancing act of being familiar for players who have played the first game, but not requiring that information for players that want to start with Deadfire. The game starts out by the Watcher, the player character from the first game, having their stronghold, which was a major mechanic of the first game, get destroyed by a giant Colossus. The Colossus is a manifestation of the god Aethys, who steals your soul as well as a bunch of your allies in order to kind of power his new body as he marches for an unknown destination past the Deadfire Archipelago. So the story kind of comes off with two threads, one personal and one more open. The personal being that your character now has to try to reclaim their own soul, but also this question of what is the god doing manifested in this way? What's his goal? Is it going to be benevolent, or is it something more sinister? So right away there's kind of these multiple motivations for following Aethys and his new Colossus body, and you can decide through your role-playing choices whether you're more interested in revenge on your soul or whether you're more interested in making sure the people of the archipelago are safe and not harmed. So from the get-go, there's a lot of these kind of intertwined narrative threads and lots of opportunities to role-play the character you want to play as. While the plot synopsis of Deadfire doesn't ever really evolve beyond chasing after this now god-inhabited Colossus across the ocean, I feel like describing it in that way, while technically true, is also doing it a bit of a disservice. During the process of unveiling why Aethys is behaving in this manner, the player character will come into contact with up to 4 factions, 5 if you include the gods, about their goals for the Deadfire, their response to Aethys' sudden appearance, and this is where the writing of the game really shines. Mechanically, Deadfire makes the proper sorts of refinements and additions to the foundation that was set in the original game. The most obvious and clear cut of these examples is the trimming of the party size from 6 to 5. What this results in is combat encounters that aren't quite such a mess of spell effects and people that are body blocking and characters getting stuck on terrain. It just ends up being a slightly more polished experience. In the other direction, Deadfire has really expanded on player choice when it comes to building their character with the addition of multi-classing and an expansion of the subclass system. So what that allows is players to really kind of focus their character in a very specific role and gives a great deal of flexibility to the sort of fighter you want to create. Even allied party members, once recruited, will have the option of being a multi-class unit if you wish it. In addition to this, there is an extensive AI tool which will allow you to fine-tune the actions that these guys will take when you're not directly controlling them. Very similar to Final Fantasy XII's Gambit system, only on steroids, and that's putting it lightly. For those playing on an easier difficulty, micromanaging the AI doesn't really become a necessity, though it would be more useful if playing on the game's Trial of Iron or Path of the Damned modes, which do return from the first game. If playing on a normal difficulty or lower, the default AI functions incredibly well, with only a small amount of micromanagement needed for placing certain spells such as Aloth's Walls or healing at appropriate times with your healer unit. Another little tool that is actually borrowed from Tyranny is the mouse over tooltip mechanic that you can use during conversation to learn more about a specific phrase or a specific history, and it actually ends up being more impactful than you might think on paper. For instance, certain characters in different places will refer to other people or their bosses or the history of a location, and without having to be expository to you and talk in a manner that seems, gamey or fake. Instead, the dialogue is presented a little bit more naturally, and then the player, through repetition of a certain phrase or of a certain proper noun, will learn in a more natural way. It actually pairs very strongly with the fact that all of the dialogue in Deadfire is voice acted. And I talked about this in my Divinity Original Sin 2 review, where this ends up having a huge impact in the way the game is presented. I feel like it ends up having two clear results. One is that it ends up kind of as a mediating force for the dialogue, in that it doesn't allow any one character to end up over expositioning a certain description of a location or a certain history that they're presenting to you. There's a lot more natural ebb and flow, and it kind of, in a way, trims it into a manner that's a lot more digestible. There wasn't any time that I found myself glazing over dialogue because it no longer was interesting. It also helps establish a sense of belonging, for lack of a better word, for every single NPC in the game. Returning to a weapons merchant who has a particular manner of speaking just carries a little bit more weight compared to a voiceless character that just simply exists for you to drop off your unneeded merchandise. The factions that you come into contact with in Deadfire expectedly have kind of different points of view when it comes to the proper course of action to take with the main quest line, with the side quests, with what should be undertaken and in what priority. However, the game does kind of add a few wrinkles to that. Within each faction, there are disagreements about exactly the proper way of dealing with the current events of the moment. But in at least two of the factions, for instance, you can completely supplement out the leadership if you feel like you don't agree with the method that they're undertaking, but you do want to eventually side with them. So it ends up being a fair bit more involved than simply picking team A, B, C, or D. And if you end up going against the wishes of a certain faction in the way that you complete a quest objective, that doesn't necessarily lock you out of further progress within their favor. It just simply might make it more difficult or might branch it out. You're actually able to stay in good standing with all four factions up until near the very end of the game. So it's pretty flexible in terms of allowing you to role play the way you want without locking you to a certain allegiance. Outside of the aforementioned fact that the main story beats are relatively straightforward, there are two weaknesses that I wanted to at least acknowledge. One is that the naval combat is done in this abstracted kind of storybook engagement method, which I don't really think lands as well as it could have. I found early on that it was a lot more interesting to just board enemy ships immediately and then go into the polished actual combat system rather than engage in the pen and paper method. The second weakness was just boils down to a moderate level of polish thing, which I'm pretty sure will be buffed out with a few patches, but it was enough to kind of notice during my time with the game. For instance, I had a few issues with the UI properly registering some of my clicks, and I also had a few cases where quests wouldn't seem to properly recognize that I had done things in a certain order. For instance, I had a time where one of the sidekicks, Maya, steps away as part of her personal quest, only to show her on the boat assisting me during a boarding operation while she had been supposedly absent. I'm sure these are the sorts of things that will be buffed out relatively quickly, but I did want to notice them because they are present at the moment. One thing that I was generally pleased by was the lack of bugs with respect to the journal and our quest logs. Very rarely did I ever have a quest get stuck or get into a state that was uncompletable. NPCs were always where they were expected to be, and triggers always seemed to occur when they were supposed to in terms of moving quests forward. But all in all, these are just minor nitpicks of an experience that I had a great deal of fun with. All put together, Deadfire is cerebral, it's engaging, it has fun set pieces, at the same time it has more personal stories, and it has basically everything that you want from a game of this style. The mechanics of the class system, the item management, the dialogue system, and the intermeshing stories, it all comes together to form a package that is, for lack of a better phrase, exactly the sum of its parts. Even if you're not familiar with Obsidian's recent work or this style of game in general, Deadfire is one of the best RPGs of the year so far, and it is definitely a voyage worth embarking on.